Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 27th of October of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important updates are coming from Moscow. Today, according to information we have, the Russians have adopted a new head of the aerospace forces of Russian Federation, and his name is Viktor Musavirovich. This is a very interesting person, and he's going to be in charge of Russian aerospace forces. And I'll remind you that somewhere a year ago, the Russians adopted on the same position Surovikin, and we remember that he has the name of the General Armageddon, because after the Russians adopted Surovikin as the head of aerospace forces, the Russians started bombing and attacking the Ukraine energy facilities. And something tells me that the Russians adopted this person on this position with the same purposes. Currently is already 27th of October, and somewhere the same period of time a year ago, the Russians have started the bombing, so I expect that the Russians will do the same in the very near future. Furthermore, the United Kingdom intelligence reported that the Russians, when the Russians bombed and attacked Ukraine with Caliber missiles and Kinzhal missiles, took place something around months ago. And during the previous months, the Russians were not attacking the territory of Ukraine, and we understand that the Russians were trying to concentrate missiles before one big strike. We understand, of course, some sources are saying that the Russians are planning to collapse Ukraine completely, energy facility completely, to black out Ukraine for a very long period of time, but we need to understand one thing. No matter how many missiles the Russians are planning to use to shut down Ukraine, to black out Ukraine, it's not the question whether the Russians are able to shut down Ukraine for 100%, to make 100% blackout. Obviously, it's impossible. Anyway, the Ukrainians will be able to restore everything, to fix everything, and so on. The question is how long, how much time the Russians are able to win as a result of another blackout. And obviously we understand that currently on the territory of special military operation there are a few very important battles. The battle for Kupiansk area in Kislovka-Kotlerovka, there is a very heavy battle for Bakhmut, there is a very heavy, the fiercest and the heaviest battle for Avdiivka, a strong clashes in the vicinity of Novomikhailivka, there are Russian attempts to return control in Vremivka tactical bridgehead, the clashes inside of Rabotin and Bradley Square, and Ukraine attempts to land their infantry on the Russian side of Kherson. So a lot of battles, and the Russians understand that at the most important moment they need to black out Ukraine, to cut electricity, to cut Ukraine possibilities to bring forces, to redeploy reinforcement, and for these purposes the only possible solution is to use missiles. And as soon as the Russians are able to black out Ukraine, they're gonna have up to 2 weeks. It's the biggest time, the biggest time the Russians have, just 2 weeks. After that, the Ukrainians will be able to restore everything, and then everything is going to be on schedule. But during these 2 weeks, the Russians will be able to completely defeat the Ukrainians and to collapse not even one front line, but maybe every single one that we have discussed. So this is the situation, and this is exactly what the Russians are planning to use. One more time, remember the face of the next General Armageddon that will shut down Ukraine, that will collapse Ukraine energy facilities, that who will black out Ukraine during the next months. Now we are moving to the situation on the ground. Today the Ministry of Defense published a daily report about the situation, and the Ministry of Defense reported that when talking, for example, Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost up to 2,000 soldiers, 42 armored vehicles, and 16 artillery systems. So up to 5 battalions were destroyed during the previous week. When talking about the situation on the ground, there are no changes in this area. According to information we have, the Russians continue their digging in deeper in the northern flank of Avdiivka. Also, the Russians are trying to improve their positions on the Ukrainian side of the railways on the south of Novokalinova, and some sources are saying that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed even to get the edge positions of Ukrainians in the village, but we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation of that. Furthermore, the Russians continue preparation of the upcoming storm of the northern part of Avdiivka. Maybe as soon as the weather is going to get better, the Russians will launch the most important attack, and also they will try to shut down Ukraine electricity, and the main purpose purpose on the northern part of Avdiivka is going to be to take control over the chemical plant. Furthermore, the Russians continue improving their positions on the south. They have already established control over a few territories, as we discussed, and as I understand, during the next week or maybe this weekend, the Russians will try to capture more territories, and they will try to maintain the gray zone and to capture these two lines. And if we calculate the distance between this gray cloud and the northern gray cloud, these territories, we're going to see that the distance is around 5 kilometers. So this is going to be a cauldron, a real cauldron. And as you can see, the Russians are using, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation are using completely different tactics and strategic in comparison with Wagner forces in Bakhmut. If you remember the battle for Bakhmut, the Russians started from the most easiest targets, and step by step the Russians were improving and increasing the difficulties of attack. First the Russians attacked Solidar, then they captured few villages around the city Bakhmut, and that was it. Of course, it's a war. Everything, there is nothing easy in this special military operation. But Wagner's took a decision to capture easy points, and after they capture every single easy point around Bakhmut, Wagner's launched a significant storm of the city, and the most difficult and the hardest point they were storming in the end of Battle of Bakhmut. And we are talking about the western fortifications like Domino, Constructor. That was the most difficult fortification area, and the Wagners were storming this area in the final stage of the battle for the city. But when talking about Avdiivka, we see that the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation took a decision to use completely different approach. On this battle, the Russians took a decision to capture the most difficult part at the beginning, and then to capture the easiest part step by step. It's completely two different strategies and tactics. For example, when talking about Bakhmut, in the short term, we see that the level of losses was very low because the Wagners were capturing easy points. But in the long-term perspective, we see that the losses either of the Ukrainians and the Russians was very heavy, because the battle was like 6 months or 8 months. Every single day there was the very heavy losses from both sides. But when talking about the Ministry of Defense tactics, by attacking in direction of the most difficult directions, the Russians have a very big losses at the beginning of the operation. And in a short-term perspective, the Russians are going to have significant number of losses because basically they're attacking the most difficult fortifications. But in long-term perspective, the Russians are going to have very low losses because basically in the beginning of the operation they're going to make the most difficult part, and then they will establish a cauldron, and then you just need artillery, FPV drones, and that's it. You don't need even to storm Avdiivka, you don't need even to storm the cities like Lastachkina, Tonenka, Severna, Orlovka. You don't need this. The Ukrainians will be forced to step back because they will be under very heavy pressure from chemical plant, from Avdiivka Terikon, and so on. So this is completely two different tactics, and as I understand, the Russians took a decision to use the method of the strongest points at the beginning, and then like to see according to the schedule and according to the situation that develops in this area. During the previous night, the Ukrainians bombed and attacked Donetsk with cluster rounds. We don't have any updates regarding the casualties among the losses, but this is another episode of military crime against the Donetsk People Republic. When talking about southern direction, we haven't received nothing from this area, just only one geolocation from between Ugledar and Vadiana. The Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian position inside of like a coal mine, and as a result of anti-tank missile, that position was destroyed, and basically at this small front line, the Ukrainians got blind and deaf, at least for a day or maybe more. The Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of clashes for a week on South Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 885 soldiers, 22 armored vehicles, and 4 artillery systems. The level of losses is normal for this area, but as I understand, we're going to receive the intensifying of actions because the Russians continue their offensive operation in direction of Priyutina, and that this situation will lead to more losses from both sides, obviously. When talking about Orozhaina, there was a small operational pause, and during the previous few days we haven't received even a single geolocated video of how the Russians were bombing and attacking this village with FA-500, and today the Russians start publishing the videos one more time. So maybe there was some kind of pause, or maybe there was some kind of rotation or whatever, but anyway, Now the Russians continue doing the same as they did a few weeks ago, and like at the beginning of the previous week and the end as well. Now we are moving to Zaporozhye direction. We got a lot of updates from this territory. The Russians published another video how they managed to discover and destroy Ukrainian positions, artillery position with Iskander strike. Very long distance. As a result of strike, another Ukrainian artillery position was destroyed. Of course, almost every single day the Russian published significant number of videos with destroyed armored vehicles, artillery system, tanks. But one more time, I'll remind you that since the beginning of this year, we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation that the Russians managed to destroy Ukrainian HIMARS system. And this is a very, very, very interesting update. And I'm very interested what is the reason why the Russians can't discover and destroy Ukrainian HIMARS systems. On this video we see how the Ukrainians using HIMARS system discovered Russian EW electronic warfare equipment, and as a result of strike they managed to destroy it. When talking about Bradley Square itself, there were very heavy clashes in the vicinity of Robotyne. The Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions with flamethrower systems on the south of Robotyne, the area where the Ukrainians tried to concentrate their forces. The Russians tried to launch a counter-offensive operation with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to step back from the south and Robotyne fortification, and after that artillery preparation, the Russians took a decision to launch an attack. And for those purposes, the Russians were using just like armored vehicles like BMP and with infantry on board, and the Russians started its movement with the support of two machines, but at some point one machine got on mine and was destroyed, and that forced the Russians to retreat, because they understand that the fields were mined and maybe the Russians were not ready for further offensive operation. That was too risky to lose so many manpower in suicide counter-offensive operation, and the Russians took a decision to step back. So no progress in this area. Interesting updates are coming from the south Robotyne fields. The Russian sources published the video how they managed to discover another Ukrainian armored vehicle group, like few armored vehicles, few tanks, and the Russians started bombing and attacking them. And this the most valuable part of this video is that few days ago we got the video how the Russians managed to establish control over this territory. So as I understand, the Russians couldn't establish a stable foothold, couldn't dig in deeper, and they were forced to step back. Let's increase the number of updates. For example, this is it. Like on the 19th of October, the Russians published the video of their attack in this direction with armored vehicles. As you can see, this is the area, and they managed to capture this territory. But one more time, as I understand, the Russians were forced to step back, and that's why I took a decision to update the map, and currently this territory is shown as the area in the gray zone, not under Ukrainian control, but probably in the gray zone. When talking about the entire scope, the Russians reported that as a result of clashes on Zaporozhye direction, the Ukrainians lost 485 soldiers and 20 armored vehicles. So the level of losses is normal for this area since the beginning of Ukraine's greatest counter-offensive operation. When talking about Kherson direction, we haven't received more updates in comparison with the previous video. The Ukrainians continue bombing and attacking the Russian forces with FPV drones. Today the Russians published the video of Ukrainian supply roads. On this video we can see how the Ukrainians using boat tried to evacuate maybe wounded soldiers, or maybe the Ukrainians brought some ammo or equipment, and after that they were moving back. There are a few important things from this video, and the first one is that the Russians control everything. They can see and calculate the number of Ukrainian forces that arrives on the islands and the number of Ukrainian forces that have been evacuated from this area. Another important thing that we can say is that the Russians don't have 100% possibilities to destroy every single boat that goes along the Dnipro River, and this is another important thing. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on this direction, the Ukraine lost 485 soldiers, 20 armored vehicles. The level of losses is very heavy, but the same. The level of losses is the same for this territory as the previous week and the week before. Interesting updates are coming from Pravdina. The Russians reported that they managed to discover the Ukrainian ammo depot, or probably the position of air defense system, and as a result of strike that system was destroyed. There is one important thing from this video is that the Russians attacked this territory with old type of Lancet. This is not like the Lancet that can be that is self-navigated. This Lancet needs some help of operator of some soldier who will coordinate its strikes. So as we can see, the Russians still have a lot of FPV Lancet strikes of old generations and of new generation as well. Now we are moving to Kupiansk-Liman front lines, to Artyomovsk-Bakhmut direction. We got some updates from these territories as well. As you can see, according to Bakhmut, there are no big updates, no geolocations, but the Russians are saying that currently the Russians are trying to develop their positions on the west from Yahidne-Berkhovka, and the sources are saying that as a result of FPV drone strikes, as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to restore some positions on the south of Berkhovka water reservoir and to take control over a few trenches and fortifications and shelters in this direction. Just a small improvement of the Russian progress of the Russian forces in this area. When talking about Siversk direction, we haven't received anything. When talking about Kupiansk-Liman, the Russians reported that the total losses of Ukrainians on Liman direction was around 1,000 soldiers for a week, and this is a very big losses. For example, if we compare the level of losses with the previous week, we're gonna see that Ukrainians on Liman lost 940 soldiers. So we see that just for another 100 soldiers more, the Ukrainians had losses during the previous week in the comparison with 2 weeks before. We haven't received a lot of geolocations. The situation is stable in this area. There are very heavy clashes on Kislovka-Kotlarovka area. The Russians destroyed another Ukrainian Krab artillery system, but without any changes on the ground. During the previous week, the Ukrainians lost 705 soldiers on Kupiansk direction, and the previous week the Ukrainians lost on the same area 995. So basically we see the reduction of activity of the Ukrainian Russian forces, which also can be explained with the battle of Avdiivka. Currently the main Russian focus is on the territory of Avdiivka, so that's why the other front lines have some possibilities to get some rest, some operational pause until the Russians will solve the issue of Avdiivka. Furthermore, very interesting update we got from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation regarding Ukraine aircrafts, and the Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of all these sky-to-sky missile strike, as a result of usage of R-37M missile, the Russians, since the 1st of October, managed to shoot down 31 Ukrainian aircraft. 31 is a significantly big number. Obviously, with this tempo, the Ukrainians will lose their aircraft before the new year comes. And on this video, we can see how the Russians managed to discover and to destroy Ukrainian ammo depot that was located in Voznesensk, very far from the main Russian positions. I don't remember any updates from this territory, and the Russians were not attacking this area for a very long time. And I'll remind you that somewhere in this area is also the Ukrainian Ukrainian nuclear power plant. So this is a very important strategical area for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians keep a lot of air defense systems in this area. The Ukrainians have significant number of ammo depots, tanks, because this nuclear power plant is something like a natural barrier, because the Russians don't want to risk to attack nuclear power plant because the consequences can be unpredictable. So that's why the Russians try to avoid this territory. But starting this day, the Russians start bombing this area, and maybe this strikes also connected with new General Armageddon that was adopted as the head of Russian airspace forces. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.